So today I'm going to talk about women and economic insecurity. And now this is really bread and butter issues here, coming right down to the ability to have financial, psychological and social freedoms for women in this region. Much of my work is, I'm from Singapore, I'm Singaporean. So when you look at Singapore's context, you don't really think in terms of economic insecurity, but that of course does not mean we don't have economically insecure people in Singapore. But this particular presentation and my work, my larger work actually focuses on Southeast Asia, and mostly I look at the emerging economies of Southeast Asia. So I look at countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and to some extent Philippines, Indonesia. So just very quickly, and all our speakers have actually done this, but I just want to give you a historical context. But in this context, I want to look at it specifically from an economic point of view. So when we speak in terms of women and economic security, and we take a look at history, and here I'm talking about pre-colonial times, and even before that, before I get into the presentation, I just want to say that when we speak in terms of economic growth and economic progress in Southeast Asia, we must acknowledge the fact that it has been on the backs of women that this region has grown. And this is true even pre-colonial times, and I'll get into that in my presentation itself. So basically, women had an extremely prominent role in the economy before we had basically the Europeans come in here, before colonial times, and much of the local industries, whether it was spices or batik or even agriculture, right? So were managed and they were administered by women, and women had a lot of freedom of movement in public spaces, and they had economic agency. So they could actually that, of course, that didn't mean that men were not important. Men were still part of the labor force, but it was just like Sister Mary John was saying, it was more of an equal opportunity situation. Like they both could appear in the public space as they were in the private space. So it wasn't like one go out and one stay at home. That was not the situation. And the female labor force actually, in fact, was highly valued in this part of the world, especially because we did a lot of rice cultivation and also small animal husbandry. Now, rice cultivation is an extremely labor-intensive activity, and as a result, it required entire families to be involved in the production of this crop. So women had a lot of economic value. And this is one of the reasons why when we look at the history of female infanticide, Southeast Asia did not have very high rates of female infanticide. Whereas when we study the same situation in East Asia, excuse me, and in South Asia, we see the numbers of female infanticide very high. One of these reasons is because we needed women to be participating in the economy. They were important economic actors. They had economic agency, and they were in freedom of movement in the public space. However, with imported philosophies that came in together with colonialism, has increasingly put women in subordination positions. Now, just very quickly talk about the colonial period. There was a great change in the nature of work for women during this time. They were hired as cheap labor in many of the plantations and in many of the processing factories, right? So whether they were rubber plantations or whatever they were doing, spice or batik or whatever the Europeans wanted to take out of this region for export, and a lot of women were put in as cheap labor to participate in these economic activities. There was also a change in customary laws where there was a reduction in women's autonomy, and there was a strengthening of the position of men in the household. So women sort of started disappearing from the public space and moving more into private into their homes. And the concept of head of household at this time, which always meant the man, the husband, was the head of the household, and the women would be at home taking care of, she would be a home, housewife, taking care of children and all that. This concept exists till today. And one of CEDAW's committee's recommendation, I believe, Samena, you mentioned CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. All our countries, all the Southeast Asian countries, it's actually the most ratified human rights instrument in the world, but also the one with the most number of reservations. Only 6 countries have not ratified CEDAW. US is one of them, surprisingly, but CEDAW has the most number of reservations. And, one of the recommendations of the CEDAW committee, I don't know about the other countries, but for Singapore, has been to take away this concept of head of household, because the nature of the household has changed drastically in the late 20th and the 21st century. It's no longer, so we have house husbands, we have single family homes, we have same-sex partner homes. So we can't really take that concept of head of household and then everything is policies are sort of created and implemented based on that concept. So when we trace it back, we'll find that this concept of the head of household is pretty much, well, I wouldn't say it's just from the colonial period, but it's certainly a sort of solidified during this time. The idea that men would be the breadwinners and women will be the homemakers in that sense. Another very important impact of the colonial period was the commodification of women as sex workers. Now, when I'll give you the case of Singapore, when we had the British bringing in a lot of manual laborers, mostly from South and East Asia over here, they created a sort of a very majority male space where the number of women were less. So as a result, they also started bringing in a lot of women prostitutes or sex workers from around the region, from China, from Japan, in order to sort of service these, not only the Asian men, but also the European men. Of course, I'm not saying that they invented prostitution, obviously not. Prostitution has existed here well, since forever, I guess. It is the oldest occupation, if I'm not mistaken. But what has happened during the colonial period, it became a very, and this is research done by other scholars, it became a very racialized colonial form of racialized colonial capitalism, right? And an economy was created around where women were commodified and they were appropriated for colonial needs. So once again, as I said, prostitution didn't occur here because of colonialism, but it certainly became an economy to satisfy the needs of both Asian as well as Western men. And but however, in the late, I think in the early 20th century, with the increase in communication and transportation and all that, we had a lot of women coming over to this region to be with their husbands, and as a result, the economy itself broke down a bit. The sex worker economy broke down a bit, and the demand for Asian sex workers were reduced during that time. Okay, now my next point here is the pepper trade and the shift of women's position. Now, pepper was a very important cash crop in this region during the colonial times, and it affected the women's position in society. Now, pre-colonial times, women were the ones who actually dealt with traders from around the world, be they from China or wherever they came from, in trading black pepper or pepper nigrum. So they were the managers of this trade. But once it became an important colonial export product, what happened was that, well, very simply, the colonialists, there was an increase in demand for pepper, and the colonialists didn't want women handling it because it moved beyond a household production system, and they got more men involved in the trade. And over time, the women were eradicated from the management and administration of the trade. The trading locations changed from nearby towns into the ports, which were far away. Women found it difficult to travel with their children or to leave their children for a few days when they would go and trade and then come back. That was difficult for them. Gradually, the control of pepper trade fell into the hands of the men in their family, and the role of women got reduced to menial tasks like sifting the good seeds from the bad, or packaging, right? Especially during the in the Dutch and English trading posts of the region. So basically, the Spice Islands and Java and places like that. Of course, another thing is the import of cheap machinery. This was especially after the Industrial Revolution in Europe, where you had the advent of a lot of machinery was being used in factories and all that. And these guys, the colonialists, they sort of imported it into these regions. And then manufacturing of, for example, like cigars and weaving in Manila, or tobacco and batik printing in Indonesia, were taken over by machines rather than being done by hand, which would have been the job of women at that time. So they lost autonomy that way. Machines dominated mass production. I'll come back to the machines and technology towards the end of my presentation, because then you see it's just like a big cycle. But now we're talking about more high-tech type machines and technology like AI and all that. But anyway, for now, the machines dominated the mass production in economy. And of course, the European model of capitalism sought more male labor than female labor. And, finally, there was this whole idea of the influence of a European urban respectability. So towards the late 19th century, many of the Asian societies here, the Asian societies, they sort of emulated a middle class or upper middle class, because a lot of them became traders. A lot of them, came up according to like a socioeconomic status, and they wanted to emulate the middle or upper middle class of Europe. And when you look at those folks over there in Europe, you would see that men go out of the homes to work and do male things, whatever it is they do, whether they drink in pubs and all that. Where women stayed at home, they took care of things in the household and managed the children, their education, and so on. And this was a kind of a respectability when it came to households. And people over this part of the world, they wanted to emulate that. And therefore, they had this sort of influence of European urban respectability. And this was an idea that was imported from during colonial times. And actually, it stuck right through post-colonial times too. It's only in recent times that we have obviously changed with much more information and education of women and economic opportunities. So here I'm going to talk a bit about the decolonization and also the emergence of nation states in this region. So basically post-independence time, and how there was sort of decolonization, post-independence, and the renewed importance and interest in women's labor. Well, the Southeast Asian societies in the 1960s underwent another significant change where women became essential as factory workers because we shifted to like export-oriented economies. So we needed women to do all those production type work, which required patience and long hours. So we got them out of their homes into the factories. And of course, into the the late 70s and 80s, we saw all out this region, all the different countries, we were like really forging ahead when it came to economic growth. And like I said, on the backs of women, because many, the whole idea of mobile men, stationary women no longer existed. So women were not only moving into factories and working, they were also moving out of their countries and working. And, they were sending back money. And, especially inter Southeast Asia movement. from different countries to countries within this region, and later on, of course, internationally, not only within this region. So you will see a slight shift in the gender roles, but of course, all this does not mean women were overly empowered or they had absolute control over their lives, because sometimes it was absolute necessity that they had to leave families, they had to take jobs in factories, work grueling hours for very little pay, and of course, having to travel out of your country, probably a village or a town, a place you never moved beyond its borders, and then now there you are in another country working very far away from anything or anyone you know. And of course, when they go into these factories and when they go into let's say for domestic workers, if they're not specialized, they go into these homes. There's a host of problems that faces themselves, loneliness just being one of it. Of course, that's a very important factor. Many of them are lonely, they have depression, but at the same time, they earn very low wages. And it has been useful for governments working together with a lot of transnational corporations to determine and to retain low wages of women workers, because that sort of gave an advantage to countries that wanted these corporations to come in. And the research has been done by some scholars in this region who actually examine foreign direct investment and wages of women. And although this is not a very explored area of research or even an area of interest for a lot of people, especially when I'm speaking of policymakers and all that, but they have found that where the wages of women are low, they were more attractive for transnational corporations to come in. It was like a race to the bottom. So they kept wages low, so they would be attractive to these companies, right? As for women migrant workers, in their own countries, in their home countries, there were two things going on. There were punitive measures being developed around these female migrant workers. Of course, if you're highly trained and specialized, as over the years in the 90s and then the 2000s, if you're highly trained and specialized, you would go out as nurses and teachers globally. But if you did not have that privilege of education, for instance, but you end up going out, you still have opportunities to go out, you go out as domestic workers, or waiters, or whatever jobs that your qualifications can get you. So there was a series of punitive and pastoral measures that occurred. That's how big a group of female workers were going out of countries like the Philippines and Indonesia. So Philippines, we had a whole series of punitive measures, pastoral measures that the government had come up with. Things like institutional and legal frameworks around workers who are going out to work, whether they were protective measures, whether they were measures in terms of coming back and rejoining their communities and their countries and employment and all that. But there were also punitive measures in a way, like for countries like Indonesia, which continue to keep wages of domestic helpers low so that they would be competitive when it came to this market, this economy of domestic workers from this region. So we had a whole lot of policies. That's how number one, the number of women who are going out, and these are young and unmarried women, mostly young and unmarried. But they contributed large percentage, especially in countries like Philippines and Indonesia. Large percent of their GDP actually is accounted for by remittances from these migrant workers, and a large majority of these migrant workers are women. And of course, at the same time, while they are going out to work and earning money and sending back, those who are back in their home countries, they continue to engage in agro-based work, which means they are very important to food security, not only of their homes, but very often in their regional or even national systems of food security. Well, almost up to 50% of, well, it depends on the country you're talking about. Women's contribution in agriculture goes up to around 50% in countries like Cambodia, Indonesia, and Thailand. Thailand is a bit higher because it's also export crop. Rice is also an export crop. And more than 50% in places like Vietnam, excuse me, and Laos. In Philippines, their actual participation in rice production is lower for women, but women are very involved in the management decisions and in inputs in hiring of labor and matters such as that, which is higher than in the other parts. So what I'm trying to say here is not only were women who left providing for the economy, it was also women who were behind and in their homes also actively contributing to not only the food security of the countries, but also in terms of the income, the national income of the countries. Okay, now just want to talk about labor-intensive industries and the systemic discrimination. Now, when I touched briefly on this when I talked about the race to the bottom and keeping wages low. But another thing is women's participation in these factories was seen as temporary because of childbirth and because of care burden. You know, so they don't see women as being long-term employees. And as a result, you know, a lot of the technical skills and a lot of the training that would allow them to move beyond factory workers, whether it's to move into a supervisory role or even, you know, further up into management role, those kind of training was not really available for women because they didn't see women as basically sticking around for a long time. So it wouldn't be a good, they didn't see the worth in investing in these women. However, you know, that is not to say that there are no female supervisors or managers. Of course, there are a few who actually made it. But for the majority of them, there was a sort of systemic discrimination in the system where you needed their labor, but you wanted them to remain in a particular position and not move up. So the more technical and higher skilled jobs then went to men, did not go to women. And women remained in the production lines with very little upward mobility. Now, I'm speaking in terms of the 70s, 80s, 90s, but I believe even now, there's no massive change, as in suddenly we are having a whole lot of female supervisors or managers. Okay, and now, you know, you would think that as we move along and, you know, you see how important it is to have females in the labor force, not necessarily the case. One thing is the education that is given to both boys and girls at a young age. And good news is, compared to other regions in the world, we do relatively well, because we could say that there's almost the gender gap in education has been drastically reduced in all the Southeast Asian countries. Because there are many legal provisions in states which require compulsory education for boys and girls, right? At least primary school education, or at least 10 years of education. So in Singapore, it's 10 years of education. I'm not really aware what it's like in other parts of Southeast Asia. Today, primary school enrollment for boys and girls is at a rate of 90% across the region. If you take it across the region, that's pretty high. But despite this, in the middle income countries, as well as the emerging economies of Southeast Asia, they register varying numbers of what we call OOSC, which is out of school children. So children being moved out of school for many different reasons. And this exclusion is tilted more towards removing girls than it is removing boys from school. Why? Because girls have the ability to take on wider household responsibilities, especially if their moms are overseas working, you know, and if she has younger siblings, she's able to help. Or mom doesn't have has to travel to another country, even if she travels from the village to a city, right? So like rural urban migration in that sense. Girls stay back to look after younger siblings. The cost of transportation and schooling, that's a factor. So if they have to think in terms of boy or girl, most likely it goes to boys. And there's also this ignoring of future implications of salaries that might be earned from girls that might come back to the family. They don't think of it that way. They think like, okay, girl's going to marry out and she's not going to, she's going to have to take care of her family, her in-laws over at the other side. And of course, the presumption that sons will support parents as they get older, and the parents will live with the sons. Now, the fact that girls tend to be excluded from schools is very contrary to how girls perform in schools, right? Girls perform very well in schools, even better than boys, especially in language, right, and humanities. But they perform just as well as boys in mathematics and science subjects. Okay, so it is unlikely that girls cannot perform well in STEM subjects, right? So when you talk in terms of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, right? Now, why am I bringing this up? It's because your future employment opportunities are going to be in STEM type jobs. I'm not saying of course, we will still need the humanitarians and the social scientists and all that, but look at all the technology that's going on, whether it's AI, whether it's digitalization or whatever it is. So the economic opportunities is going to be there. Now, if you do not allow girls to the opportunities to be in STEM education, you are looking at a skewed labor force for the future, where you are going to have what I call, well, not what I call, but what it is called sectoral and occupational bias. Now, sectoral bias is basically the women dominating particular sectors of caregiving, teaching, nursing, right? And those types of jobs. Now, dangerous because, well, if you look at, for example, office work, for instance, or even teaching, you're going to have a lot of digitalization of these types of jobs, and it's coming. And when it comes, who do you think is going to lose the jobs first? So it's going to be your, because remember, they don't really go up the levels very easily. There's a glass ceiling. And women tend to be, in lower ranking positions in that sense. So when you have some kind of technology coming in, and if you can get a machine to do your job faster, why would I need you? This has actually happened in the manufacturing industry, especially the garment industry, when they talk about, skills like cutting and sewing. I can get a machine to do the job of 5 people. So I save money. I might as well, use a machine. So, and it's a matter of time before, maybe, it was rolling in earlier, but now because of the pandemic, everything has been stalled in terms of looking at technology and future of work. But that's not to say it's just ended. It will come in, and we need to be prepared for that, right? So basically what I'm trying to say is, when it comes to education, young women need to be encouraged to go into STEM type education, because obviously they are capable of doing it. The only reason they don't is because of some sort of cultural bias that has been put in, that girls do not perform as well in science and tech, or some kind of ridiculous notion like that. Okay. Then I come to occupational bias. Occupational bias is simply because they are going to be within each of those sectors, right? Whether it's teaching or whatever it is, they're going to be lower end. And I did talk about this. And when we have technological breakthroughs in terms of jobs being able to be done by machines, the first ones to lose jobs a large percentage of that would be your female labor. So I think I've addressed the last point as well, women and technology, in terms of the future of work. So we need to get more women to go into STEM type jobs, STEM type training. The gender bias and what it means for economic security. I have to say that when countries in this region and governments, and not only this region but across the world, when they speak about unemployment, they're actually talking about male unemployment. If you can really look at it, who specifically talks about female unemployment, unless it's a situation where you have an aging population and you really need to have the females in the labor force, right? So especially this part of the world, we don't see any research being specifically done, or even any reporting done for that matter, when we speak specifically about female unemployment. And that goes back to this very heteronormative understanding, excuse me, of the roles of women and men, especially in a family. So when we think in unemployment, we are thinking unemployment for everyone. I'm not saying we don't think about women, but to be more specific, they would be more worried if more men were out of jobs than more women, because women have another role, and that is in the homes, right? The traditional roles anyway. So, realizing a more equitable and efficient use of human capital is very essential for Southeast Asia if it's thinking about coming out of this pandemic in a healthy way, and sort of uplifting everybody. And I will go into COVID-19 in a bit, because when development comes in and there's benefits, everyone is lifted up, right? However, when there is a crisis or a downturn risk, the suffering is disproportionate. Some people can still, sort of maintain some level of livelihood, but the ones that fall, it's not going to be the same. And unfortunately, the ones that fall are the ones who are most insecure economically, any other way, and they tend to be women, right? And not only women, but also, I would say the other marginalized groups, whether they're ethnic minorities, the Soji community, and groups who are disadvantaged in some way or another. Okay. And of course, sorry, can we just go back to the previous slide, please? I'm going to be done in a bit. I thought I'd be done, but anyway. And of course, if you don't have, if you have more women out in the economy, they sort of also drive the economic growth in terms of their spending power, the ability to consume and ability to spend. That's number one. And number two, you end up spending less in terms of social safety nets for these groups of women, especially those who can fall into poverty very easily, the ones on the fringes. So by uplifting them, you actually have tax revenue, that's one, and then you have less expenditure and on social safety measures, which can then be targeted to really help people that are way below poverty line. And then you can have very targeted measures for them. And of course, coming to, you just have to look at the reporting, ILO reports and all that. It shows that women have been heavily and very badly impacted by COVID-19. Basically, it has been, it has brought to the forefront the instability of human security for women. And human security is made up of three components, right? Freedom from want, freedom from fear, and freedom from indignities. All three of the freedoms have been compromised in COVID-19. So they have become extremely insecure in terms of personal protection. We look at a lot of domestic abuse, a lot of violence against women, VAW. We see a lot of economic insecurity in terms of loss of jobs, because a lot of them have been in informal labor. A lot of them have left jobs because they just couldn't cope with their care burden in terms of looking after the children, having to look to their education and schooling and all that. And not only children, but sometimes elderly parents or even siblings and all that who are unable, and others who are unable to take care of themselves. And there has been a disproportionate increase in unpaid work, which is what I was talking about in terms of the care burden, the increase in the care burden. I mean, personally, myself, when we had the lockdown in Singapore, I had, I had to look to my daughter's home-based learning. That was one. So I had to sit down because it's a young child, she's only 8, so I had to sit down and I had to actually go through. If I had left her free there and just gone on to do my work, I don't know what would have happened at the end of the day. But I had to like sit down, and then it took a very big toll on someone like me. And this is me with all my resources. I had the internet, I had a place, I had everything at my disposal, and even someone like me was struggling. So imagine someone who does not have all those resources, I only have one child. Imagine someone who has 3 or 4 children and not have all those resources. So the digital divide also really came to the forefront during this time, because we saw a lot of inequality in terms of the availability. Yes, you can go online and you can work and whatever it is, but what if you don't have those resources? And the ones who tend to not have those resources, or not have the ability to actually know how to use the resources because they were never trained, never taught, never exposed, also tend to be women. So, I mean, when I'm coming to the whole idea of media and reporting and all that, whenever we talk about economic security in ASEAN, we always see big picture economic security, and that's the understanding of economic security. But economic security also has another side, and that is the individual, the economic security of individuals. We never seem to actually talk enough about the economic insecurities of certain groups of people. Yes, I'm not saying we completely don't, but if you look at the main, the broadsheets and whatever it is, you see that much of it talks about it as if it's a very huge concept. But economic security is also something that can filter down to the individual, and filter down to especially individuals that are disadvantaged in one way or another. And women tend to fall into this group. So a lot of focus needs to be, I mean, if you're looking at a regional peace and stability, which is what ASEAN says, peace, stability, regional growth and all that, how do you have that when 50% of your population has fallen in the gaps, right? When in terms of your policy, so AEC, ASEAN Economic Community itself, women tend to lose out, because the jobs that actually, it is engineering, it is trade, it is stocks, it's commodities and all these things. How many women are in these jobs? And so when you talk about ASEAN Economic Community and this grand exchange of things, who are we actually talking about? We're not talking about women in that case, right? So I will just leave it at that.